welcome to the Crazy Wisdom podcast. I've got Charlie Becker here, and he is a second-generation bookseller whose family runs Houston's largest used and rare bookstore. And he's also building an AI tool for used bookstores. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I was excited when you reached out to get to talk about this.
Yeah, and you had an interesting tweet related to Anthropic. Anthropic had been going through and, well, not just Anthropic, a whole bunch of people are going through and trying to get all the used books and get them into the training data because we've essentially run out of public information for them to mine. So that now they're just going through all the history. Is that accurate? What can you tell the listeners more about what was going on there?
Yeah, so I'm pretty careful about like what I've observed and what is out on the record and what my intuition is. And so the tweet that you're referring to went crazy viral. I've written blog posts that got like 100,000 views before, and to me that was virality, and that tweet had like 1.5 million impressions. And so that was like a whole new neighborhood of fame and notoriety for something I had written down. And I'm lucky it was about something that I care about and I actually know something about. And so like I know I peeked into like your catalog a little bit, so I know you have a pretty educated audience and they know a bit about AI. But on the record, there's been this issue with these AI companies using books for training data. And that's shown up in a lot of different ways. And like one of the first kind of most notorious issues was that like one of the training data sets that they inherited or procured, depending on who you asked, had this kind of slush pile of pirated books in it. And those were digital. And that was kind of the first time this issue of books and AI came up. And depending on who you asked, either it was like an accident that it kind of folded into something bigger. And some people are, alleged that they went out and they found and pirated these books, and I'm not really in the business of parsing through, the thousands of pages of depositions to say that. But then more recently, in January, Anthropic had some court documents released showing that they actually had done something a little bit different and acquired physical books en masse to scan and use for training data, which was, I'm not familiar with how many other companies had done that before, but what really got people up in arms was that what they were doing was they were taking them and kind of industrially slicing the spines off because they're easier to, well, for two reasons. One, I can tell you they're easier to scan that way, even with the kind of really sophisticated automated book page turning things we have now. It's like 10 to 100 times faster to just kind of feed them through an old school, like you've seen like the brother printers in an office that can do it that way. It's just much faster that way. If you're doing millions of books, that time adds up. But the other reason that's kind of interesting is like our copyright system has not really caught up to AI, like we live in an interesting legal system in the US where a lot of what happens comes from precedent and how people rule. And the legislators are kind of perennially on their heels trying to figure out what's actually going on. And that's assuming, that they are informed and have the best intentions, which is an assumption that a lot of people don't make fairly, And what happened was they actually, like, I'm not clear on the causality of this, but at some point they said, okay, because of copyright, what that means is if I write a book and it gets published, someone can buy it and do whatever they want with it after they buy it. But that does not include making a copy of it to distribute. And so their rationale was that if we scan the book, we're keeping that digital copy and destroying the original. So there's no way anyone could say that we're running afoul of any copyright law. And that was essentially what the judge said. Yeah, he said, hey, like as weird as this looks, as bad as this looks, this is a slam dunk that they did not violate copyright because they destroyed the original book. And they actually, very interesting. There's like if you ever want to go down the rabbit hole, the judge cites 3 other cases where like this kind of issue came up. And one was like a pretty old case from the 80s or 90s about like Texaco or Tenneco back in the day, an energy company where the engineers were like tired of having to go all the way to their central library to find the books for the research that they were doing. And so they made copies of the books to keep in their own kind of like hub and spoke style offices. And that case, I think, was lost actually, because they were like, yeah, you can't do that. You can't, like, even if you're using it, you can't make copies of the book after you know. And then there was other, and then like the Google came up with Google Books, and there's some other things, you know. And so that's kind of where I came in, because I don't dispute anything that came out in the legal findings. I'm not some kind of like Anthropic truther where I say like, oh no, actually they weren't destroying books. You know, it's like that's on the record. What happened was I actually in late April got like a string of very bizarre orders for books on a platform that's not Amazon. So as a used bookseller, you have the option to sell the books in store or sell them on online platforms. And the big daddy platform is still Amazon, where most books are sold. But there's other places where, as a used bookseller, you can sell in other marketplaces, like eBay, ABE Books, Biblio, Alibris. There's a whole host of places people don't know about, and that's before. That's not even talking about people who run an operation out of like their garage and sell on like Facebook Marketplace or Mercari or something like that. And so on one of our non-Amazon platforms, which I'm not going to name just because of the terms of service of that platform, I want to keep my hands very clean here. We started getting like a crazy number of orders in our warehouse, you know, and so we have a storefront and a warehouse, and it was like a much higher volume of orders, but also like as someone who's been selling books for a long time, my family's been selling books for a long time, and I work in the bookstore now full time. You get a kind of sense of the rhythm of what people will buy when they come into the store and what they'll order online. And so like we don't keep any books that we never ever sell any type of that book. That would just be silly, you know, like the lone exception is like I don't know if it's sentimentality or what, but we have like a dozen boxes of Cliff's Notes that we never sell anymore, you know, old school Cliff's Notes and study guides. Other than that, we don't really keep stuff around if you know, we keep stuff that sells very slowly, and we might keep individual books that literally don't sell for 25 years. But we don't have any like sections in the store of stuff where nothing in it ever sells, either in person or online. But there's very different kind of senses of speed and rhythm on in-person and online sales. And what's kind of hard, and it's going to be hard for me to come up with examples, but like a lot of the stuff that was selling in the warehouse was stuff that very seldomly sells online, and almost never sells in batches, and never sells where it's like multiple of those types of books sell to the same person. So I was like, either some people with incredibly eclectic hobbies and voracious appetites for online purchase are suddenly like buying a lot more, or something's going on. And that's when I started like looking into like, oh, is anyone else seeing this? And a bunch of people on forums were talking about it, you know. And there were people suggesting like, oh, there's that AI thing, and I was like, And I just kind of did the economics in the back of my head. I was like, I don't really know if that makes sense here. And I talked to my parents about it, because they like have the majority stake ownership, whatever, in the bookstore still. And they said, you know, oh, well, let's just take the orders for now. We don't really know if anything weird is happening, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, I feel kind of weird about it. I don't know what's going on here, but I feel strange about continuing to sell on this one platform where we're getting these orders. That afternoon, I went to bed. I woke up the next day, and we had a single order for like 70 books, which is insane on this platform. Because first of all, it's incredibly hard to do that, and not ordinary to do that on this platform, because you have to go not searching by book, but you have to go to the book and then look at who's selling it, you know, kind of like an Amazon when you have to click like 4 times to see all the different copies of the same thing, and it shows you. You have to click on that seller page, and then you have to go search by that seller's page. So it's like a very convoluted way to even get to be able to do that. So it'd be very strange to get an order like that normally. Like I'd say 99% of our orders are a single book, you know, and 70 books is just like beyond the pale. It was so odd that we had to reach out to the platform and say, hey, how do we even send the customer the tracking numbers for these packages? There's like not enough space in the back end for us to send tracking numbers. And so then I looked, and I did some more looking, and everyone was getting purchases from the same kind of small handful of companies, and the company's name is out there. But again, in terms of service, I don't want to reveal like the name of someone I sold a book to. But if you Google this story, and if you Google who's buying these books, you'll find the name. And then they were all getting sent to the same like handful of locations, you know. And so I Googled all the locations that people were listing in the forums, and all of them were what's called FBA prep centers. Now, one more digression before I get to this anecdote, which is if you sell on Amazon like us, if you sell books on Amazon, or if you sell anything on Amazon, you have two choices. First is merchant fulfillment, which is kind of like what we do. So if you look behind me, this is not a background. This is actually my bookstore. Someone bought this book right here. I literally pull it off the shelf, put it in an envelope, and mail it. And that's called merchant fulfillment. I fulfill the order. The other option is fulfillment by Amazon, where instead of me having these shelves, I catalog the books, send a box or boxes to Amazon, and they put it in their warehouse and they fulfill it. And there's like small fees associated with that, but you also get preferential treatment because they can fulfill the order faster. A lot of times it makes you eligible for Prime and stuff like that. And so these books are being bought by one seller and they're all being sent to FBA prep centers. And so my read is like, okay, there's an old thing called bookjacking, which is where, you know, someone really smart designs an algorithm that says, oh, like this book is selling for $25 on this platform and $10 on this platform. They make another listing on this $25 platform for $22. And when they sell that, they automatically buy this book and ship it to that address. And so I'm just like, okay, I think this company got a lot of money because they're basically a giant warehouse reseller. I think they got a lot of money and they're doing some kind of weird, sophisticated, long tail arbitrage. Because when I started looking up the books that sold for us, I looked up the first 5 or 10 books. You know, I looked at the first 20 to 30 books, you know, at least 20 I can remember because I went back when a journalist asked me about this. I wanted to tell the truth, you know. And all of them either, like on our page, I could see what they were selling for in the price. And if you looked on Amazon, which is not the platform we had them listed on or we're getting these purchases on, the book either said no copies available or there was one copy available and the price was much higher than what we were selling it for. And so even though they were really bizarre kind of nonfiction books that would make a lot of sense for AI training, you know, I'm not saying this is dispositive proof that it wasn't AI. I'm just saying that like there's a much older, more banal economic mechanism that could be explaining this that's actually been happening for a long time. And the point I was trying to make in that tweet was not, hey, let's let these AI companies off the hook. Hey, I have no problem with book destruction. I say, hey, it's a tragedy. You know, it's like it's a crime against humanity. These books are being destroyed, and there may only be one copy of them. You know, like, and don't clip me unfairly there and say, oh, it's committing crimes against humanity. But it's like it really is a tragedy if any of these books are getting, you know, destroyed, and they're really rare. And rare, we can come back to and talk about what that means too. But my point was that if this bothers you, that there's this kind of opaque, corporate, profit-driven ecosystem that is destroying rare books, then you should know that there's evidence it might just be something a lot more ordinary this summer, and that it happens all the time in the background, that it's happening nonstop. Because when those books go to FBA warehouses, if I'm only doing it in the interest of making money, and I'm flipping them all for 3, 4, 5 times the profit, one, I don't have to sell every book to make a profit, and two, I'm not going to pay warehousing fees to Amazon forever to sell those books. And there's very little documentation about what happens to books that don't sell when they're being done through FBA, except that, like, they get recycled or liquidated. And liquidated mean they'd be sold to liquidators who are high volume people who may sell them in another country or do whatever they want with them. You know? But like, and that's kind of that's kind of the point I was trying to make is that, you know, and I think a lot of people glommed onto it for different reasons because they were like, oh, wow, this guy's confirmed. Some people just read the beginning and they're like, wow, this guy's confirming that it is AI. And it was actually very funny because I got interviewed about this by The Atlantic and by my local news station. And the Atlantic reporter was super cool, but it also was all via email and like 1 or 2 phone calls. And I was like, oh no, you know, and like I had all these images of like high-end journalism in my head. And I was like, oh, is this going to get twisted? And actually I read it and his article kind of disagrees with my conclusion, or he says that like a lot of the evidence points toward AI, which is fair.
Yep.
But he made me look great. He made me look very knowledgeable and authoritative and like even a little cagey. But then when the local news interviewed me, the reporter was the coolest person ever. Camera person was super cool. I think the last person who got it, like the editor, just didn't care that much because like the article they wrote to accompany the video said the opposite of what I say in the video, which is even the giant title bar at the bottom of the video says bookseller blames AI, you know, which is like the opposite of what I'm saying live. But yeah, so that's the story of the tweet and where it's gone. And I'm sure there's a lot of different directions we can go in from there.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of different directions. And it sounds like you know this industry really well. And the one thing that I didn't quite get, I'm a little slow this morning though, but maybe my listeners didn't get it either, is that what is the banal reason? Like, if in 3 sentences or so, what is the banal reason if it's not AI? It's just like these obscure resellers and auctioneers who are doing what? What are they trying to do?
So let's just take an example book, because a lot of these books are like old travel guides or old technology guides or business bestsellers from the 70s that have been rewritten better 50 times, right? So let's say we're going to take How to Negotiate by some no-name author from 1976, right? So this may be the last copy of this book that exists, right?
Wow.
We have it in our warehouse. Nobody wants it. Nobody's searching for it because they don't know the name of the author or title, and nobody's walking through our warehouse to buy it.
Uh-huh.
So if we get the purchase from the AI company, what they're going to do is they're going to scan it and destroy it, and it's gone on, save for it being on their server somewhere, and that upsets people. However, they could also look at our listing on this non-Amazon platform and be like, "Wow, they're selling this book for $6, and there's a page for it on Amazon, but no copies available. There's better discovery on Amazon. I could sell it there, so I'm going to buy it. So it gets removed from us.
Oh, got it.
They list it on Amazon for $15, but they make enough money off all the other books they bought that after 2 years of it being in Amazon's warehouse, they're like, what the hell do we need this old book for? And it still gets destroyed.
So basically two things are happening. One giant narrative about AI companies, which is supercharged because of just like 100 different things all going at once. And also this related to books and like our citizen cherishes books and all these different things. But then there's another one that could be an explanation, which is essentially that there are people doing this algorithmic trading of books. But why did it all happen to you at this one point? I guess that's like an unknown, right? Like why yeah.
So that's so the Anthropic scandal was actually happening last summer is when the majority of it was happening. And the court case happened, it came out in January. And we didn't start getting the orders. And also they didn't procure books this way for that project.
Got it. Yeah, got it.
They worked for a different company that does this kind of thing.
Got it.
That has all their own warehouses. You know what I mean? Is not sending books to FBA warehouses, right?
Got it.
And that company actually is like, also public record, don't want to name the company. I'm not here to bash anybody. That company also has like a track record of doing like, positive recycling for the government. I think they're organized as a B Corp, but that's who they worked with last time. Now, essentially, like, we got these orders in April. I wrote a blog post in early May about this. I was like, wow, this is fascinating. And I've never had a chance to have this intersection of my interest and experience before. And I put a blog post out, and I'd say, like, I don't know, 1,000 people read it. And I got like a dozen comments like, cool, that's neat. Wow. But nothing happened. And then what happened was 404 Media ran a story on like July 25th, July 22nd, something like that. And they asked another bookseller, ironically, another bookseller from Texas. I don't know who it was, but I'm not like trying to impugn that bookseller, who said, yeah, this is all AI. Getting these crazy orders, got to be AI.
Yeah.
And they quoted him off the record. And I think a lot of people just have the Anthropic AI story in their head.
Yeah.
And again, I hate to like hedge and caveat all the time, but like, I'm not letting Anthropic and the scanners and the destroyers off the hook.
Yeah, it's a real thing that's happening there.
Yes. I'm just saying that, like, I've already been working on this project for like a year for a way to kind of prevent and track this from happening. And I would rather more people know of if 100 million people are upset about the book destruction, but I can get 1 million to understand that like actually something similar is happening all the time because we don't have like a good infrastructure.
Let's talk about that. That's interesting. Okay. So, and this leads to the other points that I wanted to mention about history. And like, we're in such an interesting time right now. A lot of people kind of over the past 10 years have looked at the rise of the internet and now with the rise of AI and looked back at the 1500s, the 1450s to the 1550s. And so I've been doing a lot of reading about the book and like the nature of the book and where the book came from. And it goes back to Martin Luther, it goes back to the printers, and there's like a time period, I believe it was from like 1450 when the printing press was first invented, to 1500, where all of a sudden that's when it started to become more businessly viable. Those first printers were all screwed. They all lost a lot of money. And then by 1550, then all of a sudden there was a giant industry, both books, newspapers. They would have book fairs all over Europe. And that led us all the way until today, which is probably the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, were probably the golden age of like a market with books. And like our whole system had reached this peak of essentially like, how do you record things? How do you make sure there's provenance? How do you do all these things? And then I've been doing a show with my dad called Stewart Squared, and we basically go through the whole history of the PC industry. And my grandfather, his father, is a
I'm sorry, of the what industry?
Of the PC computer industry, basically.
Got it.
So he was a journalist in the 1980s and the 1990s and the early 2000s, basically covering the rise of the PC industry for business publications. And so and my grandfather is a journalist, a print journalist, in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And so we all share the same name, Stewart Alsop. And we have all of my grandfather's articles because they were written down and we stored them. But my dad's articles from 1980 to like 1994, before the internet, they're all disappeared. They're all gone.
Yeah.
We have like one of the largest gaps in terms of record, and which is ironic because everybody's like, oh, now it's on the internet, now it's going to be there forever, which is just not the case at all. It's like
yeah. So, man, this is a soapbox I get on all the time. I'm glad you like, and I think there's a phrase called like the narcissism of small differences, which is like a really terrible habit I have sometimes, where like I kind of mostly agree with someone about something, but I find a little thing to nitpick and it looks like we're enemies, right? And so let me caveat all this by saying like I'm pro progress, I'm pro technology, I'm pro internet, and I'm talking to someone who I think feels similarly, right? So I'm not anti-technology, I'm not anti-internet, I'm not a Luddite, although the story of the Luddites is actually quite interesting, and that's kind of an unfair term to use, but that's all to say that like I agree with you. I actually one thing I've done a ton of research on, I just have not had occasion to talk or write about yet, is actually ebook marketplaces and ebook printing and preservation. And I think the problem is worse for ebooks than physical books.
Whoa.
Because there's something like a dozen large ebook platforms were started and shuttered, and each of them took original books on those platforms with them that aren't anywhere else.
Wow.
And because everyone's like, oh, what about ebooks? And that's the thing, is it's like, when something's on the internet, it isn't forever. It's on someone else's computer, right? And they have to pay money to run that computer. A lot of times you can do that cheaply. Like I did the math, and like for my project, which we'll get to eventually, like if we want to store the metadata for 13 million books indefinitely, we could do that for like $2,000 a month for like the metadata and 4 pictures for each book. We could do that indefinitely, right? And that was kind of like the math we did. I was trying to explain like there'd be some setup cost, but we could store that forever. And the way I got to that number was like in 2010, Google Books actually estimated there'd been like 130 million books ever, individual like unique edition books ever printed. And I said, okay, we should aim to eventually get 10% of those, the 10% of the most rare. Now, earlier I said, let's talk about rare. And this is directly relevant to what you said about your father's articles. Rare often means valuable. We use it synonymously, right? But rare is not always valuable. Rare can be obscure also. It doesn't mean that it's hard to find and people want it. It can just mean that it's hard to find. Like the technical definition of rare. And so a lot of the books that we sold that kind of caught my eye was because they were rare in the latter sense. I'm not talking about like Lord Byron's first edition of his book with his handwritten notes in it. You know what I mean? I'm talking about the Downtown Guide to Tallahassee, 1985. You know what I mean? Like that's a rare book, but it doesn't mean that people are like beating down the doors to get it. Normally, I think that it's largely a discoverability issue, because I think actually most rare books, there is somebody who wants those books, but there's no easy place to go, oh, I want to find it. And right now there's nowhere on the internet that really recreates the browsing habit of a physical store.
Mm.
Like, we say that we browse the internet, but that hasn't been true since like StumbleUpon. You
Mm.
know, we go to websites that we bookmark. You know, when was the last time you sat down and were randomly typing in URLs to check out? You know, or going to like an aggregator that wasn't aggregating from much larger sources. I think one of the ironically, one of the only places that still does this really well is Hacker News,
Mm.
which is like a mainstream aggregator for the tech community. You know, built
Mm.
out of Y Combinator. It's like one of the only places where you really do get like random personal websites and little demonstrations and case studies alongside huge news stories, right? And I'm sure that a bunch of people could email me and tell me why I'm wrong about this and where it actually happens. But what bugs me is like when I have to do the short version of this story and I tell the story about like the types of books people are buying, the natural response, which I totally understand, is like, who cares? Like, who cares if someone's destroying all these random nonfiction books nobody cares about?
Yeah.
And I say, okay, that's fair, but like, who should make the decision of what gets destroyed? Like,
Right now, it's random.
Yeah,
it's
who's making that decision right now? Like, I get it. Right now, it's like the golden rule. You're like, who pays for it gets to destroy it, which is fair. That is kind of how first sale doctrine works. You know what I mean? That is, I get it. Like, we try not to be super precious about most people buying our books, but when they look like they're being commodified, we do take a really hard look at the deal we're participating in. You know?
And this goes back to history because there's another great reason besides the one you just mentioned, which is also a very good reason to think about the actual economics of it. But it's also historical provenance. Like Aristotle wrote like a book that, you know, like, well, I love the fact that I learned the last few years. There's this word called palimpsest. And basically, in the 500 AD or 500 BC, or no, in 1 AD, people were writing things down. You have like, you know, the Roman guys, Eusebius, or all these guys, they're writing things down on this paper or the lamb skin. And then, 500 AD comes around, the Roman Empire falls, and all of a sudden the Christian guys start writing over it with their like monastic duties that they're writing over these brilliant things that these Romans had talked about because they're pagans. And so they just wrote over it with like, oh, we're going to do Hail Marys this many times, and this is what this guy should do, and everything like that. And then later in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, a birth of new knowledge came because they found these palimpsests. They just continued and continued and continued and continued. And like in like 1200 AD, they were all looking for this lost mythological Aristotle book, and nobody could find it. Like, I still think it's still missing, right? So like, we have no idea how much has been lost throughout history, and now we really have no idea that we're losing all of this stuff, and now it's going into the LLMs, which is like a whole other thing. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I actually, I'm so glad you know the word palimpsest, because it's one of my favorite little sound bites. Is like, palimpsest is where you take a text and you just use the paper to rewrite something and you cover what was on it before, right? And a lot of people think the internet's an archive, but it's actually a palimpsest. It's actually like we're using the substrate of the internet to like recreate and destroy and recreate over and over, and we're not really storing stuff that well, because a lot of times functionally, like, I think people think like, oh yeah, they may take the wrong read from that and be like, oh yeah, well the palimpsest preserved those things, but it was an accident. The preservation was incidental. They didn't want to preserve those things. They were trying to write over it, and that's kind of what kind of going back to your father's thing, is like right now we say, oh yeah, well, like, who needs this travel guide? Who needs this how-to book? Who needs this dumb business book, right? Who needs all this nonfiction that is allegedly going to AI shredders? Discount my theory at all, but who needs these books? And like totally sidestep the fact that people are like, oh, the AI is uploading them, they'll be preserved that way. Not true, but like, let's just sidestep that for a moment and say, even like those things were kind of like dead ends or like intermediaries to solutions that we have now are better. Yes. Right. So maybe we don't need that business book because it never led to anything. And we don't need that travel guide because we have a better one now. But in the future, someone's going to arrive at a problem where the solution we have now doesn't work. And they're going to want to see and go back and see like the mythical Aristotle book, like, do I think that how to troubleshoot your Frigidaire 1990 one is on the same level of cultural significance and importance as Aristotle's last book? No. But like, could there be like a tinkerer or an engineer who wants that book in 100 years because they're at a different type of problem? They want to go back and see what problems, like what's been tried. Yes, that's not an unreasonable idea, you know? And so I think that like one of my kind of hobby horses that I go on and on about is like, we don't have to wait 100 or 1,000 years. One big problem is like discoverability. Because right now, all the way information is served to us on the internet most of the time is profit seeking. You know, it's like rent seeking and profit motivated. You know, is basically like anytime you go to search for something, a lot of what you're seeing is who's paid to be seen. You know, and I think that aside from libraries, which is like, I have a funny relationship to libraries as a bookseller. You know, I really appreciate them, but I've never really had a whole reason to go and spend time in a bunch of them, but I really like seeing them when I go, and I like the function that they serve from society. But aside from those, like, there's not a lot of people who are preserving things just in case someone might find them and trying to do a direct match to what you want, you know? And I think that people's natural reaction is like, oh, well, if I go looking for something and I don't get what I want, then that company's not going to make money. So that logic doesn't bear out. However, I think that what you're assuming is that they make more money from a customer like you finding what they want than from a seller getting to in front of you or to a different kind of customer.
Yeah, the aggregation of the audience is where the business comes from.
Yes, like it's like yeah, maybe that's true in like a kind of like Adam Smith daydream artisanal economy where there's like a baker and a tanner and, you know, like,
which never existed.
In the world we live in, you know what I mean? Like, that's not how it works, you know? And like, I'm a big fan of Adam Smith, but a lot of people, I think, misunderstand the thought experiments that he used to illustrate these ideas, and they try and over extrapolate these kind of first principles economics ideas, you know? And so I think like one of the issues I have is that we don't need to wait 1,000 years to find out if someone wants to find these books. Right now, unless you know what to search and you know where to search, you're not going to find them anyway.
Yeah.
You know, and that problem is being exacerbated by the fact that they're disappearing into black holes, whether that's an AI company or not.
Yeah. There's two things there, and they might be related, which is discoverability has fundamentally shifted for me with the LLMs themselves. The LLMs are getting me to books that I had never known about, and I'm asking for recommendations, that I had never thought of before, and it's leading me to really interesting territory of things that I would not normally do. Maybe it's related, but what is the business that you're doing, or what is the AI online tool? Does that help with this discoverability? What are you working on?
So I don't want to like talk all this huge game and people be like, that's what he's doing, because like basically someone said something to me a long time ago that really inspired me, where he said, you know, something an entrepreneur does in the kind of purest aspirational sense when people talk about an entrepreneur. One thing that the entrepreneur does is they see the world and they see this one dimension along which they want to move the world forward, and they try and effectualize that, you know? And so for me, I kind of look at the end state and I say, okay, well, what's the infrastructure needed for that to happen? And the end state is like better discoverability of books, a better interface between like commercial and independent book selling and like libraries. And like ideally, like I would love to see like a little used bookstore in like every neighborhood in America. I would love it if, and the world eventually, but I don't know as much about that. I would love it if like when an enterprising person is like, I need a place for people in my community to get together, you know, and have like a watering hole, you know, instead of like a pub or a coffee shop.
Interesting.
Or maybe in addition to a pub or a coffee shop, they have the means to kind of like start a used bookstore, or even like open up selling used books as a line item there. And so the main issue for us historically has been cataloging inventory and making it available for sale easily and across platforms. Right? And so there's a lot of tools that do that. And I was like, what's the hardest problem here that is like the least likely to be solved by the market? Like that it has the least obvious profit motive. And it's that if a book is printed before 1970, it lacks what's called an ISBN, an International Standard Book Number. And if you go to search for books online and you use a database, every database is built off the backbone of ISBNs. The ones that aren't and have older books do this kind of complex like title, author, year matching but it's a lot fuzzier. You know, there's no equivalent of the ISBN for books before 1970. And so if we get a box of books that we want to intake and list for sale, there's programs where we can scan the barcodes or manually enter the ISBN and it will automatically populate all the data. For a book before 1970, there's no program like that. So we've had to do things like hire really talented typists and stuff like that to kind of do it real fast. And essentially my idea was like, okay, well, what would that look like? What would that program look like? And so originally I set out to do it with one photo, like a photo of the cover would populate the, like my dream before was that I snap a picture of the cover and it populates all the data or as much as it can, both by like inference and also by searching what's out there. And we learned after about a month, because I took on a partner almost immediately, shout out to Adam, you know, because as much as I know and experiment with AI, he's literally a PhD AI computer vision specialist. So he's like literally the perfect person who I knew as like a kind of like secondary social relationship. And now we work really closely together for the last year. My dream was we would take a photo of the cover and it would populate through inference and searching what's available, a really excellent bibliographic profile within like a second, you know, and for marginal cost. Immediately we realized, okay, I can't do it with the cover. There's too many books where there's like 50 editions of the book and the cover all stays the same. You know? And so now, just for safety, since we're already opening the book and doing the title page, we do cover, title, copyright, and then we do any kind of additional interesting things about the book. Sometimes we do the spine, sometimes we do the back, depending on the book. But at minimum, we try for those 3 photos, and it automates creation of an extremely rich bibliographic metadata profile that includes the cover of the photo as like a product photo. We don't include the back-end photos in the listing because it's a lot of my fingers for now. Like we don't have like an automated thing. That's a lot of me like holding it. But we have those stored in case we want to run better, cheaper models on the same photos later and improve the data. And so you can actually do this part now with like ChatGPT. We just take a few photos of a book and you're like, I need a bibliographic profile from this, right? But we've created one that's like specialized, has a lot of domain knowledge. It does it at scale, and we can do it in batches, like at scale for like hundreds or thousands of books. And our accuracy is almost perfect. You know, it never hallucinates. It only ever maybe will like once in every like few dozen, it may like swap something, like swap a year. This should be the copyright for like, or if there's multiple copyrights. But basically, like we're iterating on that. Like we don't have any hallucination issues, you know. And what I learned doing this actually, that's made me much more fanatical about what I believed before, is that actually my idea of a picture of a cover, you know, and say my idea had evolved into just 3 pictures and then kept the same idea. So 3 pictures and then inference and search, right? Doesn't work. Because the data out there is so bad and inconsistent on most of these books. So like a fairly common, I'd say like a quarter of books where we'll have this failure mode where there might be like one picture on a super old listing on eBay, and then like a half filled, sometimes wrong entry on WorldCat, which is like the huge interlibrary database. You know, and WorldCat does not interface with any commercial platforms. You know, and so like you may have it like, so say we go back to like How to Negotiate by Jerry Smithheimer, 1975, right? Or not, let's say that was the second edition. The first edition is, you know, 10 Ways to Negotiate by Jerry Smithheimer in 1960, no ISBN. A really common failure mode will just be like an eBay listing from 5 years ago that says 10 ways to negotiate, has a picture of the cover, and that's it, and it's sold. And listing on WorldCat that says 10 ways to negotiate, Jerry Smithheimer, Houston Publishers, 1960, and that's it, right? That's a very common failure mode. And so if you're a used bookseller or you're someone who's not doing this for a living, there's zero motivation for you to populate that data. You know, to find that data, you know, and also if you did, it really doesn't tell you much. You know, it doesn't tell you what it sells for. It doesn't tell you. And so we actually realized that like we're not seeking data, we're creating data a lot of the time. Because like on the first 100 books I did, I went there and looked at them and I was like, oh my God, like when we upload this database, which we hope to soon, we will have the canonical record for like a good, like a not insignificant minority of these books. Like our record will become the one that others go to because it's got the best data and the highest quality data. Now, what's different is that we will have a master bibliographic database. We've also built it so that other people like booksellers and eventually libraries, because I recently talked to someone who was like, I bet more libraries wouldn't use this than you think. Eventually libraries could use this to create data at scale, and they would have their own client database of their own data. Like they would be able to interface, and as we load books, it'll get even faster because it'll be able to like kind of cross-reference the books in the past. They've been the same one. They're going to get like a unique universal ID number at the edition layer. But what pretty much only libraries do that no commercial platform does at scale is like a copy level database. So, and like this is where I'm going to get into the weeds here. But like for your listeners, you can think about it like an edition and a copy. Like an edition is The Great Gatsby in 1981 by Signet, right? Or by Bantam Classics. And so that's the edition. And every edition, say they print 100,000 of those, every single one has the same ISBN. But the copies are not usually distinguishable, right, in any way, like online. And what we're doing is actually, since we're only creating records based off books people own, we're going to create copy numbers so that if we start to find books where the provenance is extremely important or valuable, then we will not just have an edition level metadata record, but a copy level record the way a library does about where that book is and whether or not you can buy it. So like a lot of people do parts of this, but nobody's really tried to create a layer that interfaces with different levels so that it can like solve this problem at scale for a lot of different people. And we've created the tool and we've got the pipeline. And my family has about 500,000 books between two locations. And one of them, the warehouse is now fully separate from the bookstore, and so that we're using that to kind of build up in the database and seed the database. And once we get to like 1 million books, we'll be able to create our own weights to get even better at this and do it longer.
So this is so relevant. There's so many different episodes I've done. The most relevant one is with Jessica Talisman. I've done two ones with her. She's a data scientist and ontology geek who taught me all about ontologies, knowledge graphs, controlled vocabularies, metadata schemes, all these different things. Very, very relevant. I'll send you that episode afterwards.
I would love that.
Yeah. And that's where my head went immediately, is that you could cheeky. This is very cheeky. I'm not sure you want to do it, but you could say, you're building Palantir for bibliographies.
Yeah. I mean, like in a way it's, I guess like, I don't know, like it's kind of like, like books need a VIN number. If you know about cars, like right now they have a model number. Books need a VIN number. Yeah. And so we're trying to give books a VIN number, and that would be its own business on its own if like all the data was already out there, but it's not. So we're having to create the database and do it. Yep. And so the reason I said that, like, what I want is one of the things that we do is that I do kind of different, and I haven't talked about this recently, is we've designed our own labels that have like 4 different types of functionality. Whether you want to run QR codes, RFID, barcodes, like it's all in there. And the reason RFID works for, like, a lot of people are like, oh, don't put stickers on books. Look, I get it. I totally understand that. And we're trying to develop like some kind of like stretchy cloth thing to put around the rarer books so we can put the sticker on there. We're working on that problem right now. But we do put a sticker on the inside back cover. And I went to great lengths to find a sticker that was both archival-safe, like that wouldn't leach acid in the paper, and was removable. Which was like, I've not had a chance to talk about that. That was a huge pain in the ass because there's so many stickers that are archival safe, like a library uses them, but they're not removable. They're made, they're bonded with like concrete. It's like epoxy. You have to sit there for like an hour with a hairdryer and be very delicate. It doesn't matter, I guess, in like a 1999 textbook, but in like an 1810 Bible, that's a big deal, you know? And then the ones that are removable have all kinds of weird stuff in them that would bleach it after like a year or two, and some of these might sit 5, 10, 15 years, so we don't want to damage it. And we also want to be able to take it out. But back to your point about knowledge graphs. Yes. Like one thing that we want to eventually do is like, right now, most places that you look for books, look at them in two, they either organize book by the work or they organize books by the edition. And I haven't seen anyone really do a great job of well, I haven't seen it, so that doesn't mean that I don't want to say it's not been done. It may have been done, in which case I love, like, let me say it loudly and wrongly on the internet so people email me the best answer, right? But I haven't seen it been done where someone has like a really elegant navigable solution that links editions and works, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at, if you're curious what I mean, like if you go on Goodreads and you look for a book, you look for Don Quixote, there's a single Don Quixote. And that's why it says like, oh, 3 million people have read this, right? Because, and this is kind of where the ontology philosophy comes in, right? Because you ask like, what is a book? It's like, have 3 million people read the same edition and translation of Don Quixote? Like, well, maybe yes for Don Quixote, because everyone in Latin America reads that, like we read Shakespeare in high school, But the likelihood of that is not high, And then you have something like ABE books, or eBay is a good example, where when you go to search for it, you're just getting the edition listings returned. Like you may get, like if you search for Don Quixote, you're gonna get like 100 results, and they're all different editions, different books, And so what we're trying to create is an idea where it's like, okay, say that you want Don Quixote, but you're not really sure. If you search Don Quixote, there's an option to be like work view or edition view is eventually what we want to see, where it's like, okay, I'm more interested in parsing out like the genealogy of this work, And so I search Don Quixote, I got one page, and I say I want to see all editions, all languages, and it shows it. And like Amazon has the data to do this, but there's no incentive for Amazon to do this because that's not the business they're in. I don't begrudge them that. It'd be a huge thing to engineer from the amount of data that they have now, but we're trying to build it in from the start that eventually this is something that we want to do, But Amazon is kind of the closest, where you can see in the middle, where if you search for Don Quixote, you may get like 4 or 5 edition type, answers, like maybe 4 or 5 translations, and then you click on those, and there's 3 or 4 bindings on each one, and then it can show you like show all available, and so like you can kind of see the tree, and they've got a lot of the groundwork done, but it's a little bit different than what I'm talking about, because we think that once we do that, it actually will open up a lot of other really interesting research and commercial opportunities for people who are like, oh, well, I want to do a project on every translation of Don Quixote into a non-Latin language. I want to do a project on every translation of Don Quixote in like every Sino-Tibetan language family translation of Don Quixote, And so there's like the work Don Quixote, and then you can be able to like go over there, and that's kind of like what we hope comes from this eventually. But that's years away. For now, just a full circle in what I do. For now, the tool is a way to rapidly catalog books. And we have booksellers in mind, but we're probably, once we launch and have a few booksellers, we're probably going to have it a version where you can do it for like your own private collection or your own private library. Because it also, like we built it for non-ISBN books, but since we solved the hard problem first, if a book has an ISBN, it can do it just as well and like just as rapidly as anything else. Like if you're already going to take a photo of the book for your collection or your store, it's going to get you whatever the barcode scanner would get you anyway, And actually, we found that like for older books from the 90s, 80s, or even 2000s that aren't as popular, like the canonical ISBN listing that you do the API call to is sometimes incomplete and rarely, but not never, is incorrect. Like it will have one of the years listed wrong or something. That's increasingly less true for a book like post 2010. But it's like not impossible for a book from the 80s, 90s, 2000s.
So I want to take the next 10 minutes or so to talk about a couple different things that have been going through my mind as you talked, particularly around the private libraries and the rare books from before 1970s, because the history on this one is super interesting as well, because you guys, like the whole thing with the humanist revolution in the 1500s, which we were talking about earlier, was that you had gentlemen collectors who were just scouring Europe in order to find these beautiful books. I once saw, I can't bring it up right now, but I saw a beautiful astrology, horoscope made for the King of Rudolph or something like that, where you open it and you can do these like things in order to get the actual astrology. And it's just so crazy because that's, the time with manuscripts, and manuscripts are so beautiful because it's like so much care and attention went into those things before the printing press. But then the printing press also made it really cool so that people could have their own libraries. And then I think there's a great book that goes into the history of this. I think it was called The Library, I think, something like that. Great book. But you have these just create, like, what's going to happen? Because a lot of people are talking about, not a lot of people, some people are talking about with AI that we're moving more into a world where we're going to return to gentleman's science. Now this sort of like military industrial scientific complex that funds a lot of research. And I've done a lot of episodes on this, specifically around how 3D printing inside of universities, that labs inside of universities can now print most of their machinery with 3D printers. And so they're not paying $50,000 or $100,000 for these machines. They're printing themselves for like $20, $30. So all this is going to lead to science returning to gentleman's science. And it would be really wild if we just did the full circle and we actually returned to a sort of aristocratic, like, you know, a gentleman just having a giant library behind what you're saying. A gentleman or lady just has this giant library and is just kind of like scouring. And, you know, if the singularity people are right, and that we're entering into a world of extreme abundance, then, you know, maybe that's like, and then we'll have a middle-class aristocracy going around doing all this different stuff. Yeah. So for the last like 5-10 minutes, what do you think about that? Are you starting to see that already, or is it totally wildly fantastical?
I mean, like, so what I see in the bookstore and what I see online, you know, sometimes echo each other, but they're not always the same, you know. But like aristocratic is definitely like a hot word the last 5 years,
Yeah.
You know. And I think, like, I'm of two minds about this. Like, you know, there's someone who I really respect and admire. His name is Visakan Veerasamy. I don't know if you've never interviewed him. You should look him up.
I have interviewed him in 2019.
Oh, great guy. Awesome. I just found him, like everyone else, on Twitter, you know, and I started following. And he's like one of my permissionless mentors. Actually, maybe just one of my mentors now, because I paid him once for consulting, and he helped me solve a huge problem in a way I never would have considered. But you know, I'm a big fan of, like, I learned, I went to Texas A&M University, and I took a class. You know, I was a business major, and I promise, I'm a digression guy, but I promise I'm getting to your answer about aristocracy. There's a story on the way to the story. I took a course called Poverty and Inequality, and I was an econ major. I had been a supply chain major, but one day I was walking down the hall with this like real eccentric philosophy professor, and he said, if you can't see yourself doing what you're doing now every day for the next 25 years, you probably shouldn't have this major. And at the time, I was literally in 5 different Microsoft Excel courses. And I was like, I'm out. I'm doing econ, and I loved it. And you know, my second semester, I took a course called Poverty and Inequality, and it was a huge bait and switch, because it was actually, it should have been called like Why Welfare Sucks, you know, because that was basically like the whole course was this guy's specialty. It was an upper level course where they could do whatever he wants, you know. Wow. And what's so funny is he taught us about something called The Veil of Ignorance by a philosopher named John Rawls. And he taught it in order to debunk it. But I found his debunking lacking, and it actually made me like a lifelong fan of this theory, the Veil of Ignorance. And so, like, I'm of two minds, where it's like, on the one hand, I'm a huge fan of what you're talking about. You know, I'm a huge fan of like passion projects generally, both as like your livelihood, but also I think a lot of times today, people have this idea that if they can't turn their passion into something that generates a profit for them, it's a failure, which I think is the most ridiculous idea of all time. And like, we'd be missing out on some of the coolest things that we have in our society if everyone had always felt that way. You know, sometimes there's a passion project that will never make you any money, that you will always be a little embarrassed to talk about. And you're constantly going to be like just barely keeping it along as you work your full-time job to support yourself. And I think that actually that's something to be super proud of and in love with, not something to be ashamed about. Now, if you can make it work as a business, great, more power to you, right? But I'm a fan of that from the bottom up. You know, I don't care if you're working like the most menial job that you could find and you're barely getting by, but you have time to like practice your instrument or like collect butterflies or like spend a lot of time in your fandom forum. I don't care. I'm a fan. And I just think I carry that all the way up to what you're talking about. Because I think that's actually two questions. It's not, is aristocratic research and aristocratic projects the future? Like, I think of it as like, should people be pursuing eccentric, idiosyncratic interests to no end? And like, what is the economic shape of society to come, right? And so this one is a slam dunk yes. I think people should absolutely be pursuing that. as for what is the shape of society to come, I think it's anyone who knows how to read a GDP, like who knows what GDP means when they read the newspaper, knows that, we have less economic equality than we have in a while in the US anyway. And that's a trend that goes worldwide. And it's kind of complex because if you look at the absolute and relative, absolute welfare and relative welfare, they diverge, right? Yeah. Where it's like for the first time in human history over the last 40 years or so, maybe less, people are not dying of starvation anymore. They're dying of overeating. You know what I mean? Like we have so many vaccines that people are debating about whether we even need that many vaccines or whether actually vaccines are harmful. Whereas like 50, 60 years ago, every time a new vaccine was released, there was like a ticker tape parade. People were like, oh, wow, I know dozens of people who have died from that, And I want to sidestep talking about vaccines or weight problems or anything like that. That's not really my wheelhouse, and those are very contentious issues. I'm just saying that like we have abundance problems, but we also have inequality problems at the same time. And you have to be a little dialectical about this. Everyone who I know who I've told I've been doing media and podcast appearances is like, you're going to suffer because you're trying to bring a lot of nuance to a media ecosystem that does not like nuance. And I've seen that play out, But like, so the short is like, I have seen it, and I'm a fan of like people with immense means pursuing their idiosyncratic interests and funding research and funding projects. Not only am I a fan, I'm a beneficiary, because like I was going to do this project anyway. But last summer, I applied for a fellowship, and I got a fellowship that is essentially the result of something like this. Like a gentleman named Jim O'Shaughnessy, who's a very, very successful financier, basically set up a venture fund, and he set up this fellowship to do exactly like you're saying, to, fund people's passion projects that would explicitly not be able to get funded anywhere else, which is like how I conceived this project. Kind of a plot twist is I've actually had people reach out to me since I went viral and the project has evolved and like, hey, what could100 times the amount of money you have now? Which is something I never saw coming. I'm not really sure if we're going to do that unless we find someone that we really align with, But like, I think that I want to say that I'm a fan of that, angle of people pursuing obsessive idiosyncratic interests and funding them and funding other people to do so. And I want to kind of decouple that from the, are we creating feudalism, which I think is a much more complex issue. And I think that is also has a lot to do with like a much more complex issue that's harder to get like a good soundbite or a single stance on, because I think it's clear to say that like, yes, there's more inequality than there has been in a long time. And like relative to like our I'm going to assume I'm 38. I'm assuming you're within 10 years of me in either direction. I don't really know, but like, it is easy to see like, oh, well, actually it was a lot easier to buy a house, something happened in the 70s or 80s, and whether you want to like, and what's funny is like, there's really no, aside from inflation, there's a lot of great explanatory theories, but there's really no smoking gun there either. Like a lot, like people treat it like, oh, well, the gold standard or, blah, blah, blah. Like, yeah, very compelling. I'm not convinced that it's like as open and shut as a single explanation like that. I think there's a lot going on there. But yeah, I think I have seen it playing out. You do see people come in and buy like a ton of expensive books in one area, but also you see people come in and you see them buy a ton of inexpensive books in one area too. And so along that vertical, I'm immensely and unreservedly supportive. As far as like, am I supportive of like it being in the hands strictly of wealthy private individuals? Like I said, I'm a big fan of John Rawls, and it's like, I think if wealthy private individuals are doing it, I'm a fan. If it is exclusively their purview, that I'm a little more skeptical about. You know what I mean? I'm a big fan of like publicly funded science, or basically, like publicly funded art. I don't really know about the mechanism to do that best, and I'm sure there's a lot of downsides I could learn about too. But it's like I think that like I'm a supporter of it, of the individual kind of aristocratic science, aristocratic art. But it's also like my support does not extend to me saying like I think that's how it should be done, period.
Well, cool. Thank you so much for coming on the show. You can find Charlie D. Becker on Twitter at Charlie D. Becker So there's a D in the middle there. And also, what is the name of the application that you're building? Is their website?
Oh man, I wish we talked in a week. I actually am trying to buy a name right now, so I don't have one. But on my personal website, which is charliedbecker.com, you can sign up if you want to know more about that application. You can DM me on Twitter. I answer there. I also have a Substack. It's probably where I'm most active, and that's also charliebecker.substack.com. Or if you just Google Charlie Becker Bookstore, you'll find me in a bunch of places.
Very cool. Yeah, and we can put the show notes because this will probably release next week. So if you get the domain, we can put it in the show notes.
Oh, awesome. All right.
Thank you so much.